When we talk about short games, the conversation usually revolves around how they're overpriced. And I'm talking short games. 3 hours or less, ones that you can play in an evening start to finish instead of watching a movie. And on one hand, I understand the frustration, because why spend $15 on an hour-long game when you can spend double that on a game that has hundreds of hours of gameplay? I can't believe that Skyrim is still relevant, but here we are, I guess. On the other hand, though, there's a lot of things that short games can offer players that gigantic games simply can't. And when you completely discount short games, you're missing out on the unique experiences that they can offer. So, for now, if you can, set aside any issues you may have with the price of short games. We'll circle back around that valid concern. First though, let's talk about some of the reasons why I think short games deserve a lot more love and attention than they currently get. Short form mechanics. If you're designing a game that's meant to be tens or even hundreds of hours long, you need to create a set of rules that supports this kind of long-form gameplay. Your mechanics need to be engaging enough to retain their fun and enjoyability over a long period of time. There have been plenty of people talking about how games seem to be getting long and bloated, especially open-world RPGs. The reason for this is because not many games have mechanics that stay fun even after hundreds of hours, so eventually you just burn out on them as all of your tasks blur together into one gigantic fetch quest. That's overall a different conversation, but what I do want to point out here is that if you're a dev team and you're seeking to find mechanics that stay fun over 10 hours or 50 hours, you are going to immediately move past any mechanics that are engaging but don't stay engaging. And that's where short games come in. There are loads of game mechanics that are fun but lose their fun quickly. And by quickly, I mean anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours. Since these short-form mechanics aren't sustainable within a larger game context and games are just getting longer and longer, it means that players aren't getting to experience this other kind of short-form fun, and I think that's a shame. Just because I'd have a hard time playing the same pinball machine for 200 hours doesn't mean that I wouldn't genuinely enjoy the experience of playing it for 10 minutes. That's not to say that certain pinball machines don't hold up after 200 hours necessarily, but you get my point. Short form narrative. By the same logic, there are lots of shorter narrative experiences we just don't see in larger games because they only make sense within the context of a shorter gameplay experience. For example, Florence and When the Past Was Around both talk about grief and heartbreak. And I don't know about you, but 2 hours is kind of my upper limit for this kind of tragic story before I start getting real depressed. And for something like the Untitled Goose Game, the fun of being an asshole goose does start to get stale after a few hours, so I'm glad the game can be completed in 3 hours instead of 300. Better fit for a busy lifestyle. A lot of us are very busy. Maybe you've just started a new job or even had a kid. If you love games but feel like you just don't have time for them anymore, it sucks feeling like your only viable options come with a 40+ hour commitment. That's a work week. But that's not your only option. Shorter games can help you continue your enjoyment of the medium without bogging you down, and actually, a lot of short games are just as fun as longer ones. More accessible to inexperienced players. Short games are also more accessible to people who don't usually play games and have low amounts of game literacy. What I mean by game literacy is quite literally your ability to play video games. For example, a lot of games require players to use one joystick to move their avatar and another to move the camera. This is a motor skill, one you aren't born with and have to practice. But short games don't usually require such high degrees of game literacy, so new players have a much easier time learning how to play them. Short games aren't about practicing your combat skills to defeat a difficult boss. They don't require the effort and time to become super skilled. They're meant to be easy to pick up and master. This means that short games can be a wonderful gateway into appreciating and engaging with games as an art form for people who don't usually play video games. Pushing the Medium Part 1 welcomes beginners. Shorter games push the medium of games as an art form, trying new and shocking things that longer, higher budget games often don't. Let me explain. It requires a lot less time and resources to make a small game rather than a large one, and generally speaking, shorter games are less complicated to design and build than bigger ones. This means that solo devs or small dev teams can make and release short games. It also means that people who have never made a game before can start and finish a project in like a year or so. While experience and knowledge can be essential to creating great games, it can also lock you into doing things by tradition instead of having the fresh eyes of a beginner. Newer devs and industry veterans have different perspectives, and often the smaller projects of beginner devs push the medium in ways that are surprising and delightful. For example, there's some really cool interactive album games where you get to experience someone's original music, but also engage with it and play with it, making it your own through adjusting elements like its tempo. I think this is so freaking cool and also a really creative and unusual way of making an interactive game-like experience. It's pushing the medium of games and really testing what we can do with this art form. Even experienced devs push the medium when they make shorter games. Since these games are smaller and their budgets are smaller, there's not so much money at stake, and these developers can afford to take risks and be more experimental with their design. And if it doesn't work out, it's not like they lost millions. Pushing the Medium Part 2 Easier to Fund. On that note, if a game is smaller and therefore cheaper to make, it means that game developers have more options when it comes to finding funding for their projects. They can avoid having to enter into a potentially risky contract with a big games publisher. Because when you get involved with a publisher, you're often faced with an unfavorable royalty deal and reduced creative control. I think most players would be shocked to find out how much creative control publishers have over creative decisions, like forcing developers to make a romanceable NPC bisexual instead of strictly gay or lesbian, just so they can market the game in countries where it's illegal to be queer. This isn't done to create more bisexual characters. It's to give players the option of a heterosexual playthrough where they never encounter any queerness. Big publishers really do love to strong-arm developers into usually bad creative decisions just to maximize profit. But when you make small games, you don't have to go with a big publisher. You can find a smaller, kinder publisher because it's much easier to fund a $10,000 game than a $1 million one. And if you wanted to bypass working with a publisher entirely, it's much easier also to fund a $10,000 Kickstarter campaign than a $1 million one. Even more relevant, I think, is that smaller games can be funded by nonprofit organizations and arts foundations and even city councils. These are usually not-for-profit organizations, which means they really don't care whether or not the game itself will make a profit. Having the game funded by an organization that doesn't have a vested capital interest in it means that they'll usually be far less controlling over the creative vision. The developers have a lot more flexibility and power over the way their story is told and the way their game gets made. This means that they can push the medium and experiment and be creative in ways that they wouldn't be able to if they were working with a big games publisher that wanted them to make at least 50 hours of gameplay. All of that to say, when you play a shorter game that was funded by the Ontario Arts Council instead of Activision Blizzard, you're engaging with an experience that's probably a lot closer to what the developers, the artists, intended, rather than something that's been reshaped to make a big company a lot of money. Now, you might be thinking these are good points, but they don't stop me from being annoyed at spending $20 on something that will only provide me with 2 hours of entertainment. And fair enough. Obviously, if it makes more sense for you financially to spend $30 on a game that provides you with hundreds of hours of gameplay, you should do that. But I hope you can keep an open mind here, because I think that there are some pretty good reasons as to why you should specifically financially support shorter games that may seem overly costly to you. So let's talk about those. Better working conditions, probably. I don't think there's any way to truly understand how much work goes into making a game, or any creative endeavor for that matter, unless you actually sit down and do it yourself. In fact, we don't really know how many hours of work go into these big AAA games because often there's hundreds of people working on them simultaneously all around the world in different time zones, in different offices for years. I spent approximately 2,000 hours working on a game that was only around 5 or 6 hours of play, and that was just my portion. This wasn't counting all the other thousands of hours of work other people put into it. So because games take so long to make, and because publishers want them to be made as quickly as possible so they can start to turn a profit, developers on big games are almost always forced to crunch. Sometimes this means working 100-hour weeks for months at a time. This is cruel. This is forced by publishers and CEOs who want to cash in on a game as fast as possible, even if it means sacrificing the game's quality and the health of the people who are working on it. This is why Cyberpunk 2077 flopped so hard upon release. The game was way too big and ambitious for the amount of time the developers were given to make it, despite many of them working mandated 6-day work weeks for more than a year. Even still, the publishing side of CD Projekt Red forced them to release it even before the devs said it was ready, and we all know the rest. It's honestly a tragic story that is sadly all too common for the games industry. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but almost all of your favorite big AAA games had developers crunching to finish it. And this is why it's so important to support unionization efforts in the games industry. But if you are making a game that is only an hour rather than hundreds, there's a lot less of a pressure to crunch. You can make a game that's only an hour of play without hundreds of people working nights and weekends all around the world. And developers of short games can usually take weekends. I don't have a paper to back this up, I'm purely speaking from anecdotal and personal experience here. So, if you financially support shorter games, you are voting with your dollar. You are sending the message that you are willing to pay for shorter game experiences where the workers were treated well and not forced into abhorrent working conditions. And this is a powerful message to send in an industry that is consumed by its own bloodlust for profit. Directly supports creators. Continuing with the idea of voting with your dollar, when you buy a smaller game that was made by a small team or even an individual, there is a much higher chance that your money is going directly into their pockets. You are helping them buy food and pay their rent. So while $15 might initially seem high for a 2-hour game, it's important to keep in mind that the majority of that $15 is going to the people who made it to help them pay their bills instead of being a forgettable drop in the profit bucket of a huge corporation. And I think that's valuable. The people who work on extremely big games are given a salary and then made to work way too many hours for what they're getting paid. They might get a modest bonus if the game does well, but they also might just get laid off once the game is released. And while of course it's not always true that when you buy a short game the money is going directly to the creators, it's a whole hell of a lot more likely to happen than when you spend $60 or $70 on whatever new big game just came out. Legitimizes games as an art form. Games are art. Fight me, Kojima, I will die on this hill. So when you decide to spend money on a game, especially small, short ones, you are saying that you value the time, expertise, and expressions of the artists who worked on it, from the programmers to the composers. You are saying that you are willing to pay for a heartfelt, thought-provoking, and imaginative experience, even if it's only half an hour, because it is a valuable artistic expression to you. A lot of us would happily spend $20 to get popcorn and go see a movie or buy a DVD, and likely these movies are 3 hours and under. I think that we should have the same attitude toward buying short games. And if still you're worried about the cost, I encourage you to try to catch shorter games when they're on sale, or find and try out one of the thousands of short games that are free to play made by smaller creatives. There's loads of them on itch.io. Consider tossing them a few bucks if you played and enjoyed their work. If you're on board and want to play more short games but don't know where to begin, don't worry. I play loads of short games, and I'm going to be filling the rest of this playlist with reviews and recommendations of short games that you can try out, both the popular ones and probably a few you haven't heard of. So watch on after this video for the first short game review in this series. Thank you so much, genuinely, for watching. I hope that you have a new or renewed appreciation for all the small games of the world. Disclaimer time. A lot of what I said in this video was making generalizations. Obviously, short games are varied, and no two games are exactly the same. There are exceptions to some of the things I've said. For example, a short game could consist entirely of trying to defeat one very hard boss. A smaller games publisher could also be just as predatory and creatively controlling as a big one. But my goals here were to first speak about the usual trends of short games versus large ones, based on my own personal experiences in the games industry, and secondly, to advocate for short games, which I think are often unfairly overlooked. As always, you can find links to the references and resources used to create this video in the description. Thanks for watching again, and stay playing.